You know, we've all seen those grand portraits and read the official histories of prominent families, right? We see their mansions, we hear about their land, their legacy. But what if I told you there's this whole other story, an almost invisible one, that's completely woven into the fabric of all that success? Well, today, we're going to pull back that curtain. We're going to explore that hidden foundation, the story of the people whose lives made all of it possible.
This right here, it isn't just a historical document. It's a gut punch. Paul Jenkins, a man who actually lived it, just boils the entire system down to its most brutal core reality, the buying and selling of human beings as if they were livestock. We're starting with this quote because it's a stark reminder that behind all the economics and the history, we're talking about real people, real families, and real lasting trauma.
So, for this explainer, we're actually going to set aside the official plantation ledgers and the big house records. We're turning to a completely different kind of history, the first-hand accounts from the very people who built the world of the Dubose family. We're going to let them tell their own stories in their own words.
We're calling this the Invisible Foundation for a reason. It's the story of the community whose work, whose culture, and frankly whose sheer resilience formed the literal bedrock of the Old South. And our window into this world? It comes from this incredible collection of interviews done in the 1930s where elderly men and women who had been enslaved were finally given a chance to record their own history.
Okay, so what did it actually feel like to live and work on one of these cotton plantations? Well, the narratives paint this picture of a life that's dictated not by a clock, but by the sun. It was a life of just relentless, all-consuming work, a constant rhythm of labor that just never seemed to stop.
Sim Greeley's memory here is one you hear over and over again, from day clean to after dark. This was not a 9-to-5 job, not even close. It was your entire reality. The work started before the sun was even fully up, and often went on long after it set, especially during the absolutely grueling cotton harvest.
And this was the rhythm of that work, this unending agricultural cycle. You start with the hard labor of plowing the fields in the spring, then planting, then the miserable summer task of chopping weeds with a hoe under the hot sun, and finally, the intense, back-breaking pressure of the cotton harvest. There was no off-season. There was no real rest.
But you know, life on the plantation was more than just the endless labor. In the face of this brutal reality, people found ways to build a world of their own, a world of family, of faith, of resilience. So let's explore that internal world, the sources of strength and humanity that somehow managed to exist beyond those cotton fields.
Now, at the very heart of this internal world was a profound paradox. The narratives are crystal clear on this. Family was the absolute center of the community. It was the source of love, of identity. But at the very same time, it was terrifyingly fragile.
This was the constant, gnawing terror that just hung over every single moment of family life. The domestic slave trade could shatter a family in an instant. A husband, a wife, a child. They could be sold to a trader, often with zero warning, and just never be seen again. Gone.
So with this constant threat hanging over your head, how did people possibly endure? Well, they relied on each other. They built this powerful sense of community, and they expressed it through music, like the spirituals, which, by the way, were songs of sorrow and hope, but also often coded messages of resistance. And they did it through a deep faith, practiced in their own sacred spaces. These were the lifelines that helped them hold on to their own humanity.
This slide really captures the two worlds that existed right next to each other on the same piece of land. On one hand, you had the world of total control, the big house, the ever-watchful eye of the overseer. But then on the other hand, you had this autonomous world that the enslaved community carved out for themselves, the praise house for their own religious services, and the spirituals that carried messages the overseer couldn't even begin to understand.
And it was this internal world, this world of faith and community, that gave people the strength to hold on to the hope of freedom, a hope that would finally be put to the test when the Civil War came. But we're not going to look at the war from the battlefields. We're going to view it from the slave quarters, where news of the war meant something completely different.
So how did news of the war even travel? Through what they called the grapevine telegraph. Now, this wasn't a real device, of course. It was a secret, clandestine network of communication. Bits of news that were overheard in the big house about how the war was going would be passed secretly from person to person, from plantation to plantation, spreading like wildfire and fueling that hope of liberation.
And this, right here, is the crucial shift in perspective we have to understand. For the plantation owner, the approaching Union Army was a terrifying threat to their entire way of life. But for the people in the quarters,
Those exact same soldiers weren't an invading force, they were the physical embodiment of a dream that had been passed down for generations, the promise of freedom.
This brings up a question that's, well, it's almost impossible for us to fully wrap our heads around. After generations and generations of bondage, what did that first moment of liberation, what they called the Jubilee, what did that actually feel like? What does it feel like to be told after a lifetime of being treated as property that you are finally truly free?
The narratives describe a moment of just pure explosive joy. It was a release of generations of pain and hope, a tidal wave of emotion that just swept through the plantations. As one account put it, there was shouting and singing and crying and praying. They might not have known what was coming next, but in that one glorious moment, they knew one thing for certain: they were free.
But as the echoes of the Jubilee started to fade, a new reality began to set in. See, freedom wasn't an endpoint. It was the beginning of an entirely new and incredibly difficult journey. So what was the very first thing people did with that newfound liberty?
For a heartbreakingly large number of people, the first act of freedom wasn't about celebration. It was a desperate, soul-crushing search. They immediately set out on foot, walking for weeks, for months, sometimes for years, going from county to county, just asking strangers if they had seen a wife, a child, or a sibling who had been sold away years, or even decades before. It's just a testament to the enduring power of family and the profound cruelty of the system that tried to destroy it.
And beyond that first agonizing search, the struggle to build a new life was just immense. Think about it. They had to find work, secure a home, and build a life with absolutely no resources, no land, and no money. And they had to do it all while facing the hostility of a world that was absolutely not ready to accept their freedom. A world that would do everything in its power to keep them down.
And this brings us right back to where we started. This story of struggle and resilience and freedom, it isn't some separate secondary narrative. It is, as one historian so perfectly put it, the other half of it. It's the story that makes the first story make sense. You can't have one without the other.
The wealth and the standing of families like the DuBose were built on the backs of hundreds of enslaved people. So their journey, their resilience, their faith, their ultimate fight for freedom and family, that's not just a footnote in one family's history. It's a story that is woven into the very fabric of America. It's a story we all need to know.
And that leaves us with a question that I really hope you'll carry with you. When we tell the stories of our communities, or our nations, or even our own families, what invisible foundations are we overlooking? Whose stories are the other essential half of the ones we think we already know? And what happens when we finally decide to listen?